I'm now pleased to introduce our next speaker, Madeline Lane-McKinley. She is an adjunct professor at UC Santa Cruz and Pacific Northwest College of Art. You referred to Madeline several times in your talk. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Lane-McKinley. She is the author of Comedy Against Work, Utopian Longing in Dystopian Times. And she's also the co-author of Fag Hag. Okay. She teaches for the writing program at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and for the graduate program, Critical Studies at Pacific Northwest College of Arts. Her presentation is going to be Comedy Against Work, Laughter as Resistance. So, Madeline, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. All right, let me see. Yeah, I want to thank everyone for inviting me. This is a real pleasure. It's especially an honor to be presenting with Annie McClanahan, a friend. I'm lucky to count as a mentor as well, who's writing on tip workification and much else has had a really important influence on my thinking, especially about cultural representations of work, but much else. So in this presentation, I'm going to be drawing from my book, Comedy Against Work, which came out from Common Notions Press in 2022. And I also took this as an opportunity to extend some of the questions that appear in that book, update them, think about some insights I gained since writing that. And I'll be sharing some of the core questions that guided my research for that project, which I hope will be generative for discussion. And I'm excited about all the points of connection with Annie's presentation. So my disclosures, I have no financial interests or relationships to disclose. I wanted to begin by setting the groundwork, thinking with what Kathy Weeks calls the problem with work in her 2011 book of the same title, another key influence on my research. Weeks suggests that the problem with work is not just that it monopolizes so much time and energy, but it also dominates the social and political imaginaries. So whether defined as value-producing, productive labor in classical Marxist terms or not, work has become our social totality in late capitalism. It has absorbed all space and time, and we are always already on the clock. A state of what I describe in my book is never not working. While this is amplified by the conditions of gig work, of constant availability and flexibility, I want to stress that it applies more broadly to contemporary ideologies of work across different labor forces and cultural landscapes. In this sense, Weeks treats work as an epistemological and ontological problem. We cannot think outside the terms of work. We cannot live outside the terms of work. Even when we think, that's what we're doing, which is my particular interest with comedy. This sense of inescapability is a crucial condition of the gig economy, and more broadly, what I'll be discussing as the gig work ethic, which I'll go on to describe later in the talk. First, I want to set up some of the key problems about the relationship between cultural representations of work and our working conditions, as well as our collective desires to experience what Weeks calls in her epilogue a life against work as perhaps our only option. Okay, so early into my research, I became fascinated by the ways that this problem of work structures our experience of watching TV, regardless of genre. There is a common sense understanding that watching TV is something like the opposite of work. It is an activity of, quote, amusing ourselves to death, as Neil Postman famously put it. This is certainly the joke of the Seinfeld episode featured in these images, The Summer of George, probably my favorite episode, in which George Costanza decides 3 months, he decides 3 months of unemployment after being fired will be the summer of George. This is going to be my time to taste the fruits and let the juices drip down my chin, he tells Jerry. I proclaim this the summer of George. Much of what George ends up doing is watching TV and perfecting this activity as an art form. He installs a mini fridge into his recliner and streamlines the process quite effectively, at least to the extent that we can imagine ourselves in a state of not working in everyday life. Watching TV is perhaps a close approximation. As I'll elaborate in a bit, far more than promising us a life outside of work, watching TV can be a practice of anti-work, or at least that's its promise. However, this involves taking it seriously as a practice, thinking critically about this activity and how it is conditioning us as workers. And perhaps that just sounds like more work. I really appreciated the longer history of the sitcom, which I won't be able to get to, that Annie presented. So we'll have much to talk about there as well. But what are we doing when we watch TV? I want to ask. And what are we watching on TV? Much of the time, if not all of the time, we're watching work on TV. I became fascinated by this as a site of what I'll go on to describe as utopian dystopian contradiction. In the network TV era, during which programming was structured around mass synchronous viewership and the model of a 9-to-5 job, primetime sitcoms took place almost exclusively in one of two settings. The first of those settings is the workplace. From the Mary Tyler Moore Show to 30 Rock, the workplace has been a prolific setting in sitcoms. Even in shows like Cheers, shown here, which is ostensibly set in a space outside of work, and during after work time, it is nevertheless fixed to a workplace setting with its characters either working or talking about their work days at work, talking about their days at work. The second primary setting of the sitcom is, of course, the household, which has a longer history. And surprise, that's a workplace too. This is the punchline of one of the best episodes of I Love Lucy, entitled Job Switching, in which Lucy and Ethel agree to get, quote, real jobs, while Ricky and Fred stay at home. After Lucy and Ethel discover the headaches of non-domestic work, famously in the chocolate factory assembly line, as a homage to Charlie Chaplin, Modern Times, the episode culminates with Ricky and Fred nearly blowing up the kitchen and their revelation that the household is also a site of work. In the streaming era, we have seen this content, like the world of work itself, become more flexibilized and mobile. On the train, in the bathroom, and yes, at work, we are watching representations of work all the time. So one of the things we're doing when we watch representations of work is coping with work. It is also a form of what I think of as false compensation. This is the false promise of a 1976 essay by Carol Lopate studying daytime television and household labor. 2 years earlier, Lopate had written a critique of the emergent wages for housework movement, which demanded pay for reproductive labor, and she was speaking to the US context. Unlike Angela Davis, whose intervention a few years later brought to the foreground that in the US, Black women have been getting wages for housework as domestic workers well before this ostensible movement of housewives, Lopate suggests that housework is, quote, neither production nor consumption, a claim with which Sylvia Federici and Nicole Cox would soon describe as reduction, distortion, and avoidance. In her analysis of daytime TV, Lopate describes the ways that television programming, in the absence of wages, emotionally compensates for housework and is designed to not only accommodate, but to actually motivate the rhythms of daily chores. While Lopate offers this analysis in the context of a critique of wages for housework, her analysis of television programming describes what we might instead understand as a common form of time theft. So I want to think about this in the more recent context of managerial second screen panic during the pandemic and beyond. This is an image from an article written in 2021 for a managerial blog. spot migration entitled How Your Employees Are Watching TV on Your Dollar. Such acts of resistance remind us, as Amelia Horgan writes in her book, Lost in Work, that the crisis of work is also a crisis of social reproduction. As we are expected to take on more and more paid work, we are simultaneously expected to take on more and more unpaid care work. Individual practices of resisting work, such as online streaming, amount to what Horgan describes as tactics for staving off boredom. So I want to first discuss this phenomenon specifically in relation to The Office, which we see here. During the first week of sheltering in place in March 2020, The Office was watched for 1.23 billion minutes across streaming platforms around the world. That's roughly 2,427 years of The Office within 6 days. While the series has risen in popularity since it aired on NBC from 2005 to 2013, this was its apex. Average viewers of the show went from watching an average of 4 episodes a day to 10 episodes a day. The rate at which they watched the entire 9 series went from 54 days to 18. I have a couple of questions to think about this. What were the different social functions of The Office in this time, specifically as a representation of a traditional, if not outdated, office place and what we might call a family workplace comedy or workplace family comedy, as Annie was bringing up. And this is typified by Dunder Mifflin's promise of a, quote, limitless paper in a paperless world, right? What is the nostalgia element of this particular office in a context of overwhelming gigification, among much else? And what were viewers seeking out in this series? As much a comedy about a workplace as it is a comedy about a private household where coworkers learn to understand each other as family members. The Office is a clear articulation of the contradictions of comedy about work, what I'll go on to discuss as the utopian dystopian dialectic of laughing at work. While it may seem to be a show that makes fun of work, it has the social function of making work fun. Ultimately, it is a show about how everything meaningful in one's life happens at work. It is where you meet the love of your life, build a family, and find a sense of purpose. Setting that aside for now, let's consider this image also more closely. You'll notice in the image, the worker may or may not be in a traditional workplace. The blatantness of this second screen behavior is noteworthy. And you'll also notice that the worker is doing an activity that is presumably more and more possible under conditions of remote work. This is also an activity integral to the gig work ethic, defined by a desire to live outside of work, which is also all the while captured by the logics of self-management and precarity. It is nothing new. Domestic and service workers have historically faced criticism for how they've endured often isolative work by consuming different forms of mass media on the job. You'll notice that the worker is not looking at any of the screens, but out the window. The TV show is functioning more like a companion than an object of direct engagement. Under increasingly isolative conditions, the second screen approximates the experience of a coworker. Here, again, we encounter this tension in comedy. On the one hand, it appears as a form of work refusal. On the other hand, it numbs the agonies of work, helping the worker endure. So I'm interested in this research that came out from cord cutting, which is a media research team, as something that needs to be looked at further. And I want to also acknowledge the difficulties of researching this, of inquiring about this particular activity among workers across workforces. So this research came from cord cutting, which analyzes trends in media consumption, and they did a study of watching TV at work in 2022, What they found was that regardless of where they are, where workers are working, many workers are watching TV while at work. 42% of on-site workers and 53% of remote workers reported watching TV every week. The more considerable differences have to do with the age of the workers and the level of security at their job. At 58%, the majority of workers between the ages of 18 and 34 in jobs of less than 1 year watch TV at work, presumably, though this is not detailed, contract work, contingent labor. In addition to watching TV, the other three activities workers reported while on the clock were using social media, online shopping, and doing one or more other jobs, side hustles, more than 1 in 3 reporting the latter. So I want to understand this activity as one of the defining aspects of the gig work ethic, an orientation towards work as both never-ending and secure, which requires workers to develop isolated, sometimes secretive modes of coping and sustaining themselves. Dennis Bro describes this as a new model of perpetual productivity characterized by integrated work and leisure. In this study, workers more often explained their second screen consumption as having benefits to their performance as workers than having to do with their dissatisfaction with their job. 54% reported that it helps their concentration, and 21% reported feeling more productive after TV breaks. In addition, many workers described creating a reward system in the same fashion that we might think of the false compensation in the housework model that I discussed earlier. I'll just point to this breakdown of genres also. So it's noteworthy that comedy is the top genre, but that also all the other top genres, educational, sports, reality, news, and cooking, are nonfiction genres, with true crime, drama, and science fiction at the bottom of the list. And I want to think more about this in our discussion, but among the comedies being watched, again, we can assume that the majority are in some way also representations of work. I want to return to what I'm posing as the utopian dystopian dialectic of comedy about work and the conditions of possibility for a comedy against work, rooted in competing conceptions of the joke as a form of relief or a form of domination. The joke speaks to the unspeakable. We laugh at work because work is a joke. When so much of our everyday lives demand of us to take work seriously, laughing at work can be understood as a form of critical negation, undermining and perhaps even sabotaging our ideological conditions as workers. Walter Benjamin famously described laughter as the most revolutionary emotion of the masses. Writing of Chaplin, Benjamin's conception of laughter is inseparable from the collective experience of the audience. What does it mean to laugh under different conditions, such as the isolation of the second screen? To the utopian possibilities of laughing with an audience in the cinema, we encounter the dystopian counterpart of the laugh track featured in so much nostalgia binging in sitcoms today, layered over a silent, multitasking worker. However little we might be able to escape our working conditions, we laugh at work out of our shared longing to get a life, as Kathy Weeks writes. We laugh to get our lives back from work, even while we know that may be impossible. As Weeks suggests, a life always exceeds what we have, and its getting is thus necessarily an incomplete process. Rather than burdening life with a fixed content, that is, with too many assumptions about what might count as a life beyond work, the possibility of the provocation lies in its capacity to pose a political project that it does not stipulate and to open up a post-work speculative horizon that it cannot fix in advance. While comedies about work can be more and less positioned against work and more and less facilitating of anti-work critique, we need interpretive methods to enhance our tactics of resistance. So where Annie is thinking a lot about narrative representation, I've since writing my book been thinking more and more about questions of spectatorship alongside her thinking of typographication, which involves sharpening our interpretive methods. So we can also, in sharpening our interpretive methods, in thinking about our interpretive methods, we can also recognize different representational strategies for a comedy against work. In thinking with the contradictions in comedy about work, I'm interested in the questions of how comedy orients against work and how various modes of representation facilitate anti-work critique. So Annie's theory of typographication as both an economic process and a mode of representation examines the picaresque narrative structure of contemporary TV shows about tip work as a way to map what she describes as the, quote, gradual erosion of the wage contract as the model for employment relations, an erosion that also led to the attenuation and superannuation of the institutions that once mediated between workers and employers, the union, the state, and middle management. Drawing from this concept of the tip work picaresque, I've written about what I've described as an anti-serial impulse in contemporary comedies as a source of anti-work critique and post-work longing in Week's terms. Roger Hagedorn famously described serialization as the ideal form of narrative representation under capitalism, precisely for its capacity to both mirror and counteract capitalist temporalities. Today's serialized content, David Buxton suggests, tends to imitate finance capitalism in its internal structure. Potential plot lines are created continuously from episode 1 to maintain a relentless rhythm of accumulation. In neo-sitcoms like The Office onward, we can track a steady serialization of the episodic format beyond the will they, won't they arc, which provided a sufficient momentum in the era of network programming. By contrast, we might look to more recent workplace comedy shows like The Bear as taking a hyper-serialized narrative structure, including multiple timelines, backstories, and subplots for each character, and building towards climaxes within episodes and seasons. I want to suggest that an anti-serial impulse, by contrast, can be found in shows like Reservation Dogs. However much the characters may be motivated by personal aspirations of, quote, making it or getting out of their lives on the reservation, the series wanders through everyday spaces, taking steps forward, backward, and sideways, often with moments of discovery. This is not the non or anti-progress of the tip work picaresque, as in series like Atlanta, which so often unfolds as a saga of breaking even, or at least in its early season, but it shares many of the narrative traits. I'm interested in the anti-serial impulse as an anti-work political imaginary, often at odds within the narrative. It's a source of friction and antagonism, a mode of questioning work and estrangement, rather than an attempt to imagine beyond or outside the terms of work, as we might find in some science fiction, for instance. So it looks like I'm also interested in talking about White Lotus, but I want to distinguish the utopian potentiality of anti-seriality in comedy about work from the viewership practices specifically cultivated by series like The White Lotus. And we can talk a lot more about how this show also borrows from the rhythms and narrative structures of reality TV, with a kind of payoff, so to speak, at the end of each episode or season. As a series about vacationing, The White Lotus certainly appeals to our longing to escape work. Of course, what's most interesting about this show, as Annie just talked about, is the way that it uncovers the working conditions of resort employees. However, I'm more interested in how the narrative structure of the series itself induces a kind of work ethic in the viewer, what Jocelyn Shepatnik-Gillette, and I'm sorry if I butchered her name, she's a brilliant media scholar, has recently described as a procedural spectatorship, which compels the viewer to watch and rewatch, piecing together clues to the mystery with the expectation, again, of that final payoff. So I think, and I guess I'm closing a minute or two early, but I want to close with a few questions about anti-seriality, specifically, I guess, in anticipation that we'd be thinking about tip workification alongside this. So how does the anti-serial impulse open up different ways of viewing? Just as comedies about work have the potential to condition us as workers to make work fun rather than to make fun of it, how might the anti-serial impulse help us think against the temporalities of work? And then lastly, how do we cultivate other ways of watching against work as the basis for other forms of political resistance? Thank you.